The late 60s and early 70s were a time of great change and unrest in the United States. By 1968, the Vietnam War was reaching its peak destruction. American forces were failing, soldiers were dying, and protests were raging. In that same year, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of his Memphis hotel room. Women were restless in their assigned and assumed roles as housewives and subordinates to their male counterparts. And hippie culture and the psychedelic movement were alive and well, providing Americans with a new world view through the use of hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD. Born of this tumultuous time in the United States were a considerable number of young individuals looking to make their mark on the world and express themselves and their creativity. Out of the many individuals finding their way onto the music scene at this time, few had such an lasting influence as John Densmore, Robbie Krieger, Raymond Zarek, and Jim Morrison, and together they would be forever known as the Doors. Born in 1943 to a high-ranking naval officer in Melbourne, Florida, was Jim Morrison. Influenced greatly by Elvis Presley and the music he heard at the rhythm and blues clubs he went to as a teen, and with dreams of being a poet, Morrison attended UCLA studying film, where he met Raymond Zarek in 1965. Manzarek and his two older brothers formed and played in a band called Ray and the Ravens, and quickly decided to add Morrison to the band, who had begun writing songs rather than his usual poetry. By the end of that year, Manzarek's brothers had been replaced, and the band consisted of percussionist John Densmore, guitar player Robbie Krieger, Raymond Zarek on the organ, and singer-songwriter Jim Morrison. The band changed their name to The Doors, inspired by poet William Blake, who said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." This line was used in reference to the higher state of consciousness that many sought to achieve through the use of LSD, which had a huge influence on the band and their music. The band was signed in 1966 by founder of Elektra Records, Jack Holzman, after seeing them perform 4 nights in a row at the famed Whiskey A Go-Go. Morrison was so nervous the first time the Doors performed in front of an audience that he faced upstage for much of the performance, singing with his back to the crowd. Kovac and Flory, authors of What's That Sound, describe the group's sound as an often moody brand of late 1960s blues-based psychedelia with a tendency to linger over the darker aspects of emotional life. The Doors seemed determined to explore avenues opened up by the bad trip, with their influences relying heavily on the emerging California drug culture. Further, Morrison's lyrics were filled with grotesque and unsettling images of alienation and repression. Morrison's heavy drug and alcohol use also played a large part in the influence of the band's lyrical content and sound. Densmore played with a jazz background, which kept rhythms tight. Krieger had been trained to play Spanish flamenco, so he never used a pick, only playing with his fingers. This also contributes to the slightly Spanish or Latin sound that appears periodically within their music. The group only used a bass player in studio sessions, so at live performances, Manzarek held down the bass line on the keys, while Densmore kept the beat. Jim Morrison was considered the main songwriter of The Doors, most lyrics coming from his poems. Morrison hated the sound of his own voice, comparing it to a sick croon. Light My Fire, the group's first #1 hit, was written by guitar player Robbie Krieger as weekend homework. He was the only member of the band to complete the assignment. Break On Through was the Doors' first single, but Light My Fire ended up being the group's first #1 hit, spending 2 weeks at the top in July of 1967. Their self-titled album, The Doors, dropped in 1967, quickly rising on the charts and ending up reaching #2, second only to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Doors were the first band to have a billboard promoting their album on the Sunset Strip. The group was asked to perform Light My Fire on The Ed Sullivan Show, which received some backlash after ignoring the show's request to change the lyric, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," and singing it on national television anyway. Their second album, Strange Days, also released in 1967, sold over 1 million copies. On all albums before The Soft Parade, released in 1969, lyrics were credited simply to The Doors. However, by the time they start working on The Soft Parade, half of the writing is done by Krieger because Morrison was either drunk or high all of the time. This is the first album where the band separates writing credits. Touch Me, written by Robbie Krieger for The Soft Parade, rose to #3 on the charts. This album took 11 months to record, opposed to the 5 days it took to record their first album. This is partially due to producer Paul Rothchild's insistence on perfection, and also due to drunken Jim Morrison being nearly impossible to keep focused. The Doors' recording process was state-of-the-art for its time. They recorded on a 4-track, drums on the first track, guitar and organ on the second, Morrison's vocals on the third, and the fourth was left for overdubbing. Bruce Botnick, sound engineer for The Doors, stated this about the process of recording their first album. "The goal for me was to immerse people and put you in the room with them. To do that, I would use the outer space in my studio as an echo chamber. I had 5 Neumann M50 microphones, positioned as it would be in the listening area, and then used that combination with reverb to give you a sense of natural leakage into the rear, so it didn't have a mechanical or digital sound, but more of one that was organically analog. When we got into the second album and beyond, we were into 8-track. I could position things in the rear speakers. I feel when people go out and get a surround disc, they should get a surround disc." The group went on an extensive tour of Europe in 1968 and went to play the Hollywood Bowl and to sell out Madison Square Garden and the LA Forum that same year. In early 1969, the Doors manager Bill Siddons booked the band their first extensive tour of the United States, beginning in Miami and hitting 19 major cities across the country. The tour was canceled after its first show due to Morrison's drunken antics, which by this time were becoming too much for the rest of the band to handle. Creating a scene at the show, which was then exaggerated by the media, Morrison was charged with lewd behavior, drunkenness, and indecent exposure after being accused of revealing his genitals and feigning masturbation. He was eventually sentenced to a $500 fine and 6 months hard labor, and though an appeal was immediately filed and Morrison was released on a $50,000 bond, the tour was never to continue. It was around this time that Morrison was noticed to be heading toward a downward spiral, dragging the rest of the band along with him. The band's next album, Morrison Hotel, released in 1970, went gold in 2 days. All of the Doors' albums were produced by Paul Rothchild, except for their last, LA Woman. The album ended up being self-produced because Rothchild walked out on the recording sessions, dismissing the songs as cocktail music. This event, however, seemed to give the group a new lease on life. On their self-produced album, LA Woman, the group recorded in their longtime practice space at 8512 Santa Monica Boulevard, with a portable mixing board in an upstairs office, which reminded the group of the good times they had when they were just starting out. Morrison recorded his vocal parts in a bathroom, in which the tile provided natural acoustics. On a gold Electro Voice 676G stage microphone. He ended up ripping the door off the wall in order to communicate with his bandmates. On all albums, session musicians were hired to support the sound of the group. On this album, Botnick brings in Jerry Sheff, Elvis's bass player, to keep Morrison interested in recording. It takes just over a week to record the entire album, and once again, all songs are credited to the Doors. Shortly after this, Morrison decides to move to Paris with longtime girlfriend Patricia Corson to focus on his poetry. Even then, he still let his drinking and drug use get the best of him, his heart eventually giving out, passing away at age 27. The Doors as a foursome only functioned for less than 6 years, from 1965 to when Morrison died in 1971 at age 27. During this time, they went from singing in clubs to being signed by Elektra Records and producing 5 full albums. They produced numerous hits and sold out venues such as Madison Square Garden and the LA Forum. Their career could be seen as a train that starts off and only gets faster and faster, finally reaching speeds that it can't handle and running off the tracks, crashing and burning at the time of Morrison's death.